Welcome to Sitcom Showdown, a podcast that reviews classic sitcom episodes and inducts them into our very own Hall of Fame. As usual, one of us has chosen a sitcom episode and the other guy has no idea what it's going to be. Will they already know it? Will they love it? Can they be convinced that it's worthy? Let's find out on the Sitcom Showdown.
Hello listeners and welcome back to Sitcom Showdown for episode number 65. It's Steve here. And Jeff, how are you going over there?
I'm going alright.
Yeah? Going back to work tomorrow, aren't you? That's a bit sad.
After the Christmas break. Yes, no, that's always a bit sad.
Yeah, I went back today, but
Yeah.
what are you going to do?
Not much.
But we're going to have some fun. What are we going to talk about, Jeff?
Oh, right.
What do you got on your list there?
Well, what I've got, we're going back to the very beginning of Sitcom Showdown, Steve-O, so that should give you a big hint as to what we're looking at today.
Fawlty Towers?
We are. We're going to revisit, we're going to book a room in Fawlty Towers. This did involve, I should point out, me having to rewatch the entirety of Fawlty Towers.
Seriously?
Recently.
Seriously? Well, it's only 2 seasons.
Which was a very stressful experience.
Your blood pressure was
Lost
through the roof.
all faith in humanity. Yes. Anyway, never mind all that, because the episode we're going to be looking at today is called Communication Problems. Series 2, Episode 1, which is... which means both episodes we've selected from Fawlty Towers to be on Sitcom Showdown have both come from the 1979 series as opposed to the 1975 series. But there you go. I don't think there's much of a difference in quality between the two seasons, to be honest with you.
Nah.
They're both pretty bloody good. Anyway, the one-sentence summary for this particular episode is: tangling with the intermittently deaf Mrs. Richards
Yes.
leads Basil ever closer to a nervous breakdown. I think that's...
Inevitably towards a nervous breakdown, I would say.
Yes, as mentioned earlier, this is from 1979. It was on BBC Two in the UK. And as we also mentioned, there's 2 series of Fawlty Towers in total, making 12 episodes. And Series 1, 1975. Series 2, 1979. And Fawlty Towers, as you know, and many people know, Steve, has been called the greatest ever British sitcom.
Which possibly makes it the greatest ever sitcom.
Anyway, I'll quickly go through the formalities of running you through what Fawlty Towers is and all this, even though we all know all this. But for the people who don't...
I'll pretend I don't know anything.
Yeah, good. You know nothing.
Yeah.
The Fawlty Towers is set in a fictional hotel called Fawlty Towers in the seaside town of Torquay in Britain. The plots centre on the tense, rude and put-upon owner Basil Fawlty, who is John Cleese, his bossy wife Sybil, played by Prunella Scales, the sensible chambermaid Polly, played by writer and, what would you say, co-creator, I guess, Connie Booth.
Chambermaid? You make it sound like she's emptying the...
Yeah, the potties.
Emptying the potties or something.
Oh, she may well be. Where were we? All right, yeah, so she's like the peacemaker and the voice of reason. And then you also have the hapless but lovely Spanish waiter, Manuel. And all of them, you know, it's their attempts to get this hotel ticking over amidst all these farcical situations and all these demanding and eccentric guests. And tradespeople, like Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah.
Yes, it's written by John Cleese.
This one's got a classic eccentric guest.
It does. It's written by John Cleese and Connie Booth, and they famously went to great pains over a hell of a long period of time for both of these series, just polishing it up and then polishing it up even more and doing all that stuff. Yeah, and it paid off, I think. We'll start with John Cleese. So he plays Basil Fawlty. He's most famously in Monty Python, of course, but he did write for... Because I'm just choosing the sitcom slices of John Cleese's life. There was Doctor in the House he wrote for, and then the follow-up Doctor at Large, apparently. And he also did a lot of comedy sketch writing, and so for shows like The Frost Report and The Two Ronnies. But then he tagged on the coattails of the great goodies Tim Brooke-Taylor and Bill Oddie and Graham Garden by working with them on shows like At Last and the 1948 Show and Broaden Your Mind, which were sketch shows pre-goodies and pre-Python in which they all mixed together. Yeah. So, I mean, clearly John Cleese wasn't good enough to be a goodie, so he had to settle for writing Fawlty Towers.
Boo.
Anyway, let's move on to Prunella Scales, who plays Sybil Fawlty. Now, I've written she has the misfortune of being married to Basil, but I suppose it's a mutual misfortune. Because he also has the misfortune of being married to her.
Oh, yes, it's definitely not a one-way street.
No. Oh,
She's a bit prickly,
she can be, yeah.
bit demanding,
Oh,
and at the same time is quite happy to just let him do all the work while she does her nails or goes to play golf.
exactly. Yeah, so, well, she is a good organiser, but once she's organised something, she tends to delegate it to other people and leave them to do the things that she's organised to have done.
That's the way to be a boss.
Oh, I think so. She doesn't
Get
muck
everything
in too
lined
much.
up.
Yep, and
You
go and
set
play a round of golf.
Set people on the path, and you trust they're going to do the right thing.
Well, you'd bloody hope so. Yeah.
Not call the wrong builder.
Yeah, like Basil derails this right path all the time. He's sabotaging the train tracks. Okay.
He makes the mistake of using his own initiative.
That's where it all goes wrong. Right, so as for Prunella Scales, the actors, Dave, so she was in 1960s sitcoms. There was one called Marriage Lines, and that was with Richard Bryars of The Good Life fame, which we haven't yet covered, but I'm working on it. She was also on Coronation Street in the early 60s. Anyhow, she was in constant work, all through the 70s, and then in the 80s she was in more sitcoms. So there was a comedy called Map and Lucia, and then there was another one, After Henry, which I believe started on radio, and then they did one for TV. In the 90s, she had the lead role in a sitcom called Searching, which I'd never heard of.
No.
So nowadays, you can see Prunella doing her documentary series going up and down the canals. Now, have you ever seen this?
No.
It's her and her husband, Timbo, and then they go up and down the canals and talk about, oh, yes, we've come across an interesting bit of canal here. This was first done in 17 something, and, it's incredibly dull.
Sounds like something that, what's his face would be doing? Michael Palin.
Yeah, that sort of gear. It's very
Or Tony
picturesque,
Robinson.
though. Oh, well, yeah, quite. He likes to do his stuff in other countries, I think.
Who, Tony?
Yeah, Tones.
So you can
get a free trip.
Get a trip somewhere else.
What a scam artist.
Yep.
Sorry, Sir Tones. Okay, let's move on. So we've got Andrew Sachs. Now, he played Manuel the waiter from Barcelona, he's a nice man, Manuel, but he does have a poor grasp of the English language. This could lead to some situations. But I think even if he spoke perfect English and could understand everything Basil was screaming at him about, I think he's too trusting and naive to work effectively under Basil's rule, because part of working at Fawlty Towers, it demands a lot of lying and treachery and looking the other way and all these sorts of things, and I think he's too...
You have to be able to read the sarcasm.
That's another great skill you'd need, I think, yeah.
Because he doesn't catch it.
No, absolutely not.
Which leads to more trouble.
Oh, he's been hired because he's cheap, essentially. Cheap foreign labour.
Well, they're pretty much just giving him accommodation, aren't they?
Pretty much. That's the impression I get, yeah. And Basil is a penny pincher. Anyway, Andrew Sachs, the man, he's clearly a great actor. He's very good with physical comedy. Now, he had this solid career all through the 60s and 70s. And, in fact, even as a lad, he was in a couple of movies uncredited as a schoolboy in the 1940s.
Wow.
Yeah, because,
That far back.
his parents left Nazi Germany in 1938 because they're Jewish and popped over to England, and he must have started acting within a couple of years of arriving in the country. Amazing.
Popped over to England. They probably had to bunk down on some horrible...
Yeah, I guess he couldn't pop
ship
as such. Yeah. Anyway, as far as sitcoms go, he went on to be the lead in a sitcom called There Comes a Time in 1985 for one series.
Oh.
So
I mean, you're turning up lots of interesting things to look at here.
Oh, good.
If you can find them.
Yeah, so if you listen back to this, then take some notes. Now, also, he was the voice of the horse in Monkey. There's a lot of Australians.
Okay.
Yeah. They like to call it Monkey Magic, although the show was never called Monkey Magic.
I can't remember a horse.
Yeah, there was a horse that could transform into a dude in the second series, and the horse could... It was a white horse that Tripitaka rode around everywhere, and then we found out it could transform. It was a dragon, turned into a horse, and then it could transform into a human. Come on, Steve.
All I remember is a pig. And Sandy was a fish, wasn't he?
Yep.
Yeah, why not have a horse as well?
Okay, well, we'll move on then. Connie Booth, right? We've also already mentioned that she's a co-creator of Fawlty Towers, but she plays Polly Sherman, the hotel maid, and I think the most likeable character.
Well, definitely the most relatable.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yes, and likeable.
Oh,
yes.
Oh, good. And competent. So she's the voice of sanity from time to time. Anyway, she somehow, though, despite being the voice of sanity, can't help but get involved in all these crazy schemes.
You get the impression she's just She's diligently saving her money, putting it aside for the moment where she's got enough and she's going to be out of this joint.
I reckon so. Now, Connie Booth herself, she is American.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, she lives in London, probably spent most of her life in England, but anyway, she gave up showbiz in 95 to become a psychotherapist.
Oh.
So before Fawlty Towers, she was in Monty Python episodes and Monty Python films. But her and John Cleese got married in 1968. It lasted for about 10 years. They got divorced in 1978. And then she wouldn't talk about Fawlty Towers at all. And then someone finally cracked the facade in 2009 for a documentary and got her to talk about it.
Oh.
So I thought,
How did they do that?
I don't know. Very persuasive people.
Get her on the sauce?
Yeah, could be. Have a sherry. Have another sherry. Oh, look.
Have a nice shandy.
Yeah, one of them. Okay, now we've also got to mention the great guest star. I didn't know anything about Joan Sanderson, who plays Mrs. Richards.
Tell away.
Wow. Okay, so she lived from 1912 to 1992. So that's a good around 80 years. And she's been described as a, quote, tall and commanding actress, unquote. She was in the sitcoms Please Sir from 1968 to 72. She was in Me and My Girl, which we know quite well, from 1984 to 1988.
Yep, that had what's-his-face in it.
Yep, Robin from Robin's Nest.
Yep.
Yeah, anyway, so she didn't really do, she wasn't a sitcom trained person, so to speak. She was more of your Shakespearean actress and excellent stage actor. She was also in an episode of Rising Damp, Dave.
Nice.
Yep. Playing a character called Mother, but I don't think it was Rigsby's mother or any of the cast members' mothers. I think it's more a mother rather than the mother.
I'm tracking that one down.
Okay. Series 4 it was, by the way. Something to do with carnations and a wedding. But she was in that sitcom we mentioned earlier called After Henry with Prunella Scales playing, I think, Prunella Scales' mum. Oh, now look, that took quite a while. I'm hoping the second half, after we go off and watch this and play a little clip for the listener, I'm hoping the second half isn't quite as long, but we both know it will be.
Yeah. Don't get your hopes up, listeners.
All right, so let's nick off and watch some Fawlty Towers.
Cool.
You know nothing.
You always say, Mr. Fawlty, but I learn.
What?
I learn.
No.
I get better.
No, you don't understand.
I do.
No, you don't.
I do understand that.
You know nothing about the horse.
I know nothing about the horse.
Yes.
Which horse? Which horse I know nothing?
My horse, Nitwit.
Your horse, Nitwit.
No. Dragonfly.
It won.
Yes, I know.
I know it won, too.
Look. Please try to understand before one of us dies.
And we're back from watching Fawlty Towers. Shall I just launch straight into the synopsis? Okay.
Go ahead.
So what's happening here, in a nutshell, is we've got an A-plot of Mrs. Richards, deaf Mrs. Richards being, sometimes a deliberate pain in the bum and sometimes just inconvenient. And a B-plot of Basil betting on a horse very much against Sybil's wishes.
Yes. It's a covert operation.
Oh, it is. Now, as a side note, I'd describe this as almost being one of the least complex Fawlty Towers' plot-wise.
Yeah.
Yeah. We open in the lobby of Fawlty Towers where it's quite busy. Sybil's on the phone, not to a friend as usual, to an actual customer.
Yeah.
And Polly's also serving people at the front counter and people are bustling in and out. But
that's an indication of how busy it is.
Oh, yeah, totally. This tall, oldish lady approaches the counter and says to Polly, "Girl, give me change for this, please." And she thrusts this note at Polly.
She actually just brutally thumps it down on the table.
Yeah,
the desk.
That's after. But no, you're right. It's they both ways. They do a great job of telling you exactly who this lady is within moments of meeting her. So Polly very politely explains that she's actually in the middle of serving another chap who was already at the counter. And Polly goes back to then serving him, but Mrs. Richards says, "What?" And so then now we realise she's sort of deaf. Anyway, she says she needs change. almost pushing this other chap out the way because she's, as mentioned earlier, quite a tall lady and physically imposing. So Mrs. Richards says, look, surely this gentleman won't mind if you just give me some change. I've got a taxi that's waiting to be paid over here.
Yep.
So Polly, just to make life easy, changes her money and then goes back to serving the dude. And then a split second after...
attempts to.
That's right. Because as soon as Mrs. Richards has actually paid this taxi driver, she marches back to the counter and says, right, now I've booked a room for these many nights and I need this and this and that. Poor old Polly. A bit of a heated discussion takes place and Mrs. Richards is saying, look, you're technically still serving me as part of the money changing. And Polly says, no, I agree. Here, talk to my colleague Manuel.
Yeah,
And so
nice diversion there.
it was brilliantly done. Yes, anyway, so cue this fantastic exchange with Manuel not understanding Mrs. Richards at all and her not hearing him properly. And then they go into this whole, the who's on first routine.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, well, yeah, right. So it's basically on that. So, and they, at the end of this conversation, Mrs. Richards thinks that the manager's name is Watt. And that
CK
he's 40. Yes. Right. Anyway, that's all fantastic. So eventually Polly actually finishes serving this guy. And then she turns her attention to Mrs. Richards and finally sorts it all out and gives her the key for room 22. And Manuel takes the cases up the stairs and off they go.
Yep.
Anyway, Polly leaves the counter. So Basil approaches the counter at this stage. And then there's this guest checking out Mr. Perkins. He's a great Cockney geezer. And he gives Basil this fantastic tip on a racehorse for later that afternoon. Do you remember what that
Yes.
was, Steve?
What the tip was? It was Dragonfly,
Yep.
3 o'clock at Exeter.
Ah, perfectly brilliant. All right. You'd be great in this plot. Right, he goes, I don't suppose you're a betting man, are you, Mr. Fawlty? Basil goes... He sort of looks around furtively, checking the civils. He goes, where I used to be. Oh, which is a brilliant line. Anyway, so our man here gives Basil the hot tip, and Basil almost gets caught by Sybil. And then she does give him a warning not to get involved in any betting.
Yep.
Oh. Anyway, Manuel comes in, and he tells Basil that the lady upstairs in room 22, i.e. Mrs. Richards, is saying there's a problem with the room, and so we're off upstairs now for a great scene. So, again, we've got this whole problem up in the room of Mrs. Richards not hearing what Basil is saying.
Yep.
But I also like to think that if she could hear him, she wouldn't care. She'd just bluster through all his excuses anyway.
Yeah, she would. The outcome wouldn't be much different.
No, I don't reckon it would be. Anyway, so she's got this list of extremely picky complaints about the room. So let's go through this list. So she says she's not paying for a room, or because she's paying for a room with a bath, and so Basil goes, here is your bath. What do you mean there's no bath? There's a perfectly good bathroom.
There it is.
That's not big enough to drown a mouse, she says. And he sort of under his breath says, I wish you were a mouse. Anyway, so her other complaint is that when she requests a room with a view, she expects a decent view. Now, I think at this point we have to put a clip in.
I asked for a room with a view.
Deaf, mad, and blind. This is the view as far as I can remember, madam. Yes, this is it.
When I pay for a view, I expect something more interesting than that.
That is Torquay, madam.
No, it's not good enough.
Well, may I ask what you were expecting to see out of a Torquay hotel bedroom window? Sydney Opera House, perhaps? The hanging gardens of Babylon? Herds of wildebeest sweeping majestically?
Don't be silly. I expect to be able to see the sea.
You can see the sea. It's over there between the land and the sky.
I need a telescope to see that.
Well, may I suggest that you consider moving to a hotel closer to the sea? Or preferably in it.
The view's actually pretty good. I know it's of paper.
Yeah.
Because from some angles you can see the creases in all the backdrop. But, that's why I said to you, Steve, look, there's the sea.
Yeah, it's the big blue wobbly thing between the land and the
That's
sky.
what Baldrick says. Big blue wobbly thing that mermaids
mermaids
live
live
in. Yeah, right. So anyway, her third complaint is that the radio doesn't work. To which Basil replies, the radio works, you don't. And then he cranks it up.
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong on either count. Oh, it's
And
fantastic.
Manuel's got his fingers in his ears and he's going, oh, have mercy.
His ear piercingly loud. Oh, man. So anyway, at this point, Basil confronts her about her hearing aid. Do you have a hearing aid? Yes. Oh, would you like me to get it mended? Anyway, yes, she says, it works perfectly well, but I don't turn it on because it runs the battery down. Oh, dear.
Oh, how frustrating.
So anyway, Mrs. Richards keeps complaining about all these shortcomings, which aren't really shortcomings, and then she demands a reduction in the room price.
That's what it's all. That's what it's leading to.
Yep. Very wisely, Basil says, "Well, please speak to my wife. She handles all such matters." And Mrs. Richards says she will. And Basil bows and scrapes and saying, "Oh, you heard that all right, didn't you?" And leaves the room with Manuel. Now, what happens here is immediately, and I'm talking within 1 second of leaving that room, in the hallway, Basil asks Manuel to go to the betting shop for him to place a bet. Now, this act by Basil clearly shows that none of that stuff with Mrs. Richards bothered him, and all his concentration has been on placing his bet as soon as possible. Like, if I had an interaction like that with a customer, that would put me off for the rest of the week, but to him, it's nothing. And he's just obsessed with this bet. Amazingly, this is quite a short conversation with Manuel, who understands exactly what he's saying. So I think this has happened once or twice before. We cut to later on, and presumably Manuel has gone off and placed the bet successfully with no further complications.
Yes. So, we cut straight from that scene on the stairway to this next one, don't we, where he's come back from the betting shop. So.
Yep, absolutely right.
Nothing in between.
No. So Sybil's at the front counter, and she's on the phone to her hairdresser saying something like, "Oh, do you have Cosmo? Right, turn to page 42. Now, do you see that lady standing behind Burt Reynolds there?" It's
looking at James Caan.
Yeah, looking at James Caan. Oh, it's great. Yeah, I want hair colour like her. But yeah, they've written it in such a way that it's so effective, and you get to know exactly who Sybil is.
Sybil is, yes. Not Basil.
Brilliant.
Sybil.
Yeah. And she's on the phone to her hairdresser just chatting away with him.
I thought it was a female hairdresser.
Could be. I always thought.
Because whoever it was had the copy of Cosmo to hand, so...
Oh, look, they all have copies of Cosmo in there.
Whoever you are, you've got to have a copy of the latest Cosmo as a reference.
Yeah, for them to read while they're in the chair. Or waiting. Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I always was under the impression that in the 70s, all the celebrated hairdressers were men. Your Morris Meads and your... That's a local
Sassoon.
reference. And your Vidal Sassoon and all them sort of people.
Sassoon.
Yeah. Where are we in this thing? Okay, yes, right. So Sybil's on the phone to the hairdresser. We've had that whole thing. So it's just a little bit of character development. Now, Polly's in the office just behind the front counter, right? And so while Sybil's doing that, I think she says, "Hey, Polly, I've got to go check on the laundry. Please keep an eye on the front counter." Manuel's come in the side door to the office.
Yep.
And he says, Polly, where's Mr. Fawlty? I have money for him." And so she goes, "It's all right, he's not here. Give it to me. I'll give it to him later on." And then Polly's counting this money. But little does she know that Sybil's come back from the laundry and has looked through the doorway from the front counter to the back office and sees her counting the money.
Oh my goodness, why can't people just take their money and hold on to it?
Yeah, or bung it in
Why
their
do they
pocket.
have to give it to other people?
I don't know. It's crazy.
Right, so Polly's got Basil's money
Yep.
from Dragonfly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so yeah, and Sybil has seen this, right? And so now at this point, Mrs. Richards has come down to the counter and she's ringing the bell, right? And she's muttering about how there's no toilet paper. So Polly, who's keeping an eye on the front counter, she goes out there, poor Polly, and Mrs. Richards says, "Girl." She always just addresses her as girl, very impolitely. "There's no paper in my room. Why don't you check these things? That's what you're paid for."
Yep,
Rah,
paper.
rah, rah, rah. Yeah. Now, yes, that's a important distinction. Right, so of course there's this mix-up where Polly thinks she's talking about writing paper, which you typically get in the hotel. She explains that the paper is kept in the lounge. And so Mrs. Richards thinks that why do people have to wipe their backsides in the lounge? Anyway, yes, a mix-up. And Polly asks how many sheets she wants. And this sets Mrs. Richards off, and she's yelling and ringing the bell, going, "Manager, manager." She's not speaking to Polly anymore.
What?
Yeah, what? Because she thinks his name is what?
Yeah. She still thinks his name is what?
And he goes, "I didn't say anything." Anyway, Basil appears, and so eventually he and Polly work out that Mrs. Richards is actually after some lavatory paper. And there's a lot of having to yell because she can't hear. And they're having to explain the mix-up, and so it's impossible because she can't hear. And so Basil is screaming at her, "Turn it on!" Turn on your hearing aid, dearie. And then so he gives up after that and writes it down.
Yep, turn it on.
This is absolutely beautiful. So he holds up the piece of paper right in front of her face. And we think, thank God they've got through to her at last. But she just squints and says, "I can't read that.
Yeah.
I need my glasses."
Classic.
But then there's another whole minute while they're trying to tell her that her glasses are perched on her head. And she goes, is it worth even going through all this? I don't know if it is. Basil's saying, your glasses are there, pointing at her head, but she thinks Basil's pointing behind her.
Yeah,
and she goes
dining
off
room.
to go to the dining room to get her glasses.
And she comes back and absolutely smashes Polly, saying, why didn't you tell me they're on my head, you fool?
Yes, now this leads to another brilliant gag, which I'm sure we've got written down somewhere. Oh, man, yeah. So she comes back and yells at Polly and says, my glasses are on my head the whole time. Don't you see them? Don't you have eyes? Polly goes, yes, I do have eyes. I just don't use them because it wears the batteries down. And then...
Bum.
Now, what we didn't mention is that Polly had asked Manuel to take some toilet paper up to room 22. But at this stage, after the boom boom, we see Manuel sprinting by with 22 rolls of toilet paper in his arms.
A goofy, great smile on his face.
And Polly just shakes her head and gives up. We cut to Basil, and so he's entering the kitchen. Now, Terry's in there. We love Terry from Series 2. He's the chef, and he's preparing all his food. Basil goes to fix himself a snack, and he's sort of, humming away happily. And he's, for the viewer who can't see what I'm doing a little happy dance here. That's exactly what Basil's doing. He's humming away and dancing away. And Terry thinks this is unusual behaviour for Mr. Fawlty.
Yep.
Oh, man.
I think he might be putting some caviar on his plate, and he's got some nice
got
cheese.
Some cheese. Yeah.
He's going to get a glass of wine or something. He's
Yeah.
living the high life now.
So Terry asks him why he's so happy. Basil explains he's had some luck on the horses, but do not tell the wife. And so Basil goes about fixing his cheese and stuff, and he starts singing Camp Down Lady, famously about horse racing and winning some money. And he's doing his dance, but Sybil's entered the kitchen behind him, unbeknownst to Basil. And she can see his happy dance and everything, and she, anyway, yes.
You seem very jolly, Basil. You seem very jolly.
Jolly?
Yes, jolly, sort of happy.
Oh, happy, yes, I remember that. No, not that I noticed, dear, no. I'll report it if it happens, though.
Well, you look happy to me, Basil.
No, I'm not, dear.
All that dancing about, singing and rubbing your hands.
No, just my way of getting through the day, dear. The Samaritans were engaged.
So at this point, Basil becomes very anxious because he suspects Sybil's almost onto him. Now, we know this because he runs through the double kitchen doors at a very fast pace into the dining room where Manuel's setting the tables and bails Manuel up to tell him not to say anything to Sybil if he's asked about it, and that Manuel knows nothing about the horse. Now, he knows that Sybil's got a good idea now. She's going to go around asking questions of people. And he wants to prepare them like a lawyer preparing to be going
getting
on
all the witnesses lined up.
And
Get the story straight.
yeah. Cue the instructions for Manuel to I know nothing. Oh, this is...
Oh, boy.
Like, I know we get these scenes in every episode of Fawlty Towers, but this one particularly is about communications. And when someone, let's say a British person is saying to someone, in this case it was Spanish, you know nothing about the horse, and English isn't your first language, you're going to take that person literally. And that's what Manuel does. He goes, what do you mean I know nothing about the horse? I know everything about the... Anyway.
I'm not stupid.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you keep saying I know nothing? I'm trying my hardest. Anyway.
And he calls him a nitwit,
It's a brilliant scene.
which he takes to be the name of another horse. And oh, my goodness.
So yeah,
Spirals out of control.
we've shortened this exchange down, but it is glorious. And it does end with the understanding that Manuel does realise he is being instructed to know nothing about the horse, wink wink, even if Basil asks him about it. Right, anyway, just as Manuel and Basil come to this understanding, Sybil bursts into the dining room saying Mrs. Richards is in the office.
Yes.
There's been another incident.
Oh.
This time, she's going bananas about some £85 that's been stolen from her room. Now, Mrs. Richards wants the police to be called. Now, Sybil doesn't want that, probably quite wisely, because you don't want a whole bunch of Rozzers in the hotel, because that'll give the hotel a bad name.
Well, plus it's probably just been lost somewhere.
Oh, exactly.
It's going to turn up inevitably.
I reckon so. But, yeah, so Sybil fobs her off and says, look, we'll search all the rooms before we call the cops, but she's not happy about that, so she's gone to fetch Basil to come and deal with Mrs. Richards. So Basil's sort of... she's in the office saying, look, your hotel's full of thieves and you don't know anything about running a hotel. And Basil is shouting his response, but she goes, there's no need to shout. I've got my hearing aid turned on. So after she berates them a bit more and asks Basil, well, what have you got to say for yourself? Then we have the excellent, I'll call it the miming scene, where Basil's giving her well, like it's a very... He looks her directly in the eye, and he's replying very calmly with all the requisite small gestures. It looks like he's explaining something in a very measured and genuine, detailed way, but he's doing it all completely silently, and she thinks her hearing aid obviously isn't working, so she's cranking it up to the max, and just as Basil shouts, "I said!" well, it's a bit of a shock anyway, right into her ears, and she throws her head back, which then smacks her into a set of shelving. So he got her an absolute beauty, and Sybil's just shaking her head going, "Don't do it, Basil, don't do it." But it is brilliant, and he does... But it's the follow-up lines, Steve, isn't it?
Yep, which we'll save for later.
Okay, we'll save them for later. So after all this and some more brilliant lines, Mrs. Richards goes off upstairs, and there's a nice little scene with Sybil and Basil having like a husbandy-wifey conversation.
Yes.
Which isn't very nice, but...
Because he's still in quite a good mood at this point.
He is. So they get to discussing about what to do about this missing money of Mrs. Richards. And then John Cleese has this small soliloquy about life passing him by. Anyway, plot-wise, Sybil remembers that she saw Polly counting a substantial amount of money earlier. And so Basil knows that this is also going to lead to a certain line of questioning, asking Polly about amounts of money that's going to rumble him completely, and he'll have bet on this horse. Oh dear. So this is he's saying, "So you can't just ask her about money. It's it's accusatory. It's embarrassing. You just can't do that." She goes, "Don't be stupid, Basil." And so begins the charade of lies upon lies. Now,
so they both go in separate directions, trying to hunt Polly down as quickly as possible.
Beautifully put. So Sybil goes off to the lounge/bar, and Basil sprints into the kitchen, sees Terry, goes, Terry, where's Polly? She's in the dining room, Mr. Fawlty. So he goes in there and he just whispers a few lines, but it's too late. Sybil walks in.
Yep.
Because Basil's been saying she knows about the money, but I don't think Polly's...
She's always one step behind what's going on in this episode. Mostly.
Then, obviously, Sybil's going to ask Polly about this money. Oh, dear. And the lie's going to be exposed. But... she very wisely says, "No, that's mine. I won it on a horse. And, Mr. Fawlty got that tip from that customer. So I thought I'd put some money on it for me." And then Basil tries to turn it around and get smug and say, "You see, dear, if you'd let me put a $5 on that, we would have, 14-1, we would have won £75.
Yes, he gets too carried away here, doesn't he?
He does. He tips his hat, tips his whatever. And I think Sybil knows something that's going on. Anyway, this all sounds like pretty convincing. There's no way Sybil can actually disprove it.
No, Polly does a brilliant job.
No. But then she asked Polly what the name of the horse was. Now, we know that Polly doesn't know the name of the horse, but Sybil does know the name of the horse. This is one of those stressful scenes. Okay, so they thought it was all over.
Miming.
Yeah, exactly. So over an excruciating minute or so, Basil manages to mime to Polly from behind Sybil's back various things that lead Polly to actually name the horse correctly as Dragonfly.
No, I think she actually remembers. I think she might have caught the name earlier as she was going in or out or something like that. But obviously didn't
stick in her head.
She wasn't the one that took the bet down to the shop or anything, so it didn't stick in her head. And I think she just remembers it out of the blue towards the end of the conversation.
Right.
Because nothing he was doing could really have led her to
it was the
Dragonfly.
Earlier in the show, because it's St. George's Day, which we didn't mention, and St. George killed the dragon, and Basil was saying, "My wife's a dragon, I wish he'd killed her." Obviously, he says it in a much more clever way. And he goes, "Have you ever seen my wife making toast, Polly?" And he goes, which is her fire breathing onto a piece of bread. Okay, now he mimes that later on when he's miming to Polly.
Good point.
So now Polly knows that he's talking about the dragon. And that's the Dragonfly.
Right, you've brought me around on that, Jeff.
Oh, thanks, dude. Right, so I'm exhausted after all of that. And we're only halfway through. So a little later, Basil and Sybil are at the front counter. Now, again, we know Sybil can't disprove what Polly said, but she knows what's going on.
If I find out the money on that horse was yours,
You know what I'll do, Basil?
Gonna have to sew him back on first.
At this stage, Steve, with Sybil walking off after having threatened Basil, the Major comes past, heading towards the bar.
Looking rather dapper.
Oh, he always does. He always does. So he goes, 6 o'clock, old boy, and I think that must be when the bar opens. So Basil has to sprint in there and serve him. But he sees his opportunity here, and he offers the Major a drink, and then asks the Major if he can look after Basil's horse money winnings for him. Basil explains that he's worried that Sybil's going to go through his pockets or find the cash somehow, and he wants the Major to look after it overnight until the heat has died down. But the Major goes, oh, is it for a present or something, assuming nice things.
Yep. Well, at first he thinks Basil just wants to give him some cash.
Yeah.
Well, first he thinks Basil wants to borrow cash, and then he thinks Basil wants to give him cash, and then he thinks it's for a gift, and he never...
Yeah, good point.
So far behind the eight ball.
Yeah, and it's communication difficulties,
Yes.
isn't it? Ah, yes, well pointed out. Anyway, he manages to give the Major the money. He's confirmed that the Major understands he has to give it back to Basil tomorrow so Basil can put it in the bank. And then he does that cool move, putting the ice in his drink using his arm. And
Yep.
Yeah, people will
Pops
know
a
what I
cube
mean.
into his glass.
Oh, and we can all breathe a sigh of relief. Now we cut to the next day. Temporarily. Basil's at the counter when Mrs. Richards comes up and asks him if he's phoned the police yet. Now, to cut a long story short here, Steve, we've got a scene where Basil lies, says he's phoned the cops, but then there's a call from Mrs. Richards where she can't hear the person on the other end. This phone is broken, she says. And what happens is basically Basil has to... There's a whole phone comedy thing, right, unrelated to the two main plots, which is why I'm not going into detail. But it further illustrates what a quarrelsome old bat she is. Anyway, next up, the Major strolls through after this phone comedy scene, and Basil goes over to ask him for the money back that he gave to the Major last night. The Major, being a doddery old dude, he doesn't remember any of this. Basil's tearing his hair out by this stage. He's trying desperately to get the Major to remember and get his money back, but suddenly Mrs. Richards storms back in, saying that Basil had shamelessly lied to her about phoning the police. He's been caught in a lie. Sybil had told her off-screen that they were still searching the rooms. Yes, anyway, Basil now has to deal with Mrs. Richards. He just leaves the Major there looking confused. Now, Mrs. Richards has had enough. She's going to call the cops herself. She's going to use the hotel phone. And while this is happening, the Major exclaims, "I've found that money, Fawlty!" and says he had it in his pocket. Now, Sybil and Mrs. Richards are there.
Say what?
What? Yeah, exactly. Oh,
CK
now,
what?
Don't do it, Steve. Right, so Sybil's very pleased that the Major has found Mrs. Richards' money, and she grabs it off him and hands it to Mrs. Richards, who immediately starts counting it. And Basil's a quivering mess at this point because he can see his horse money going completely down the drain. When Mrs. Richards yells out, "Oh, this money is £10 short." So she lost 85. She's taken Basil's 75 quid winnings.
Yep.
She's £10 short. Oh, this is a nightmare.
Somebody's going to have to make up the difference.
No. Here's the worst thing, right? So Basil knows he's lost all his winnings, but he's also going to have to pay another 10 quid. That's just awful. Now, let's take a quick pause and a sidestep here, Steve. Now, using pointing the 75 quid back then, using the inflation calculator UK, comes out in today's money to being about £600.
Yep.
Now,
how many euros is that? We know they use euros in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. So another tenner would be another £80.
Yep.
Right?
It's nothing to sniff at.
In dollar terms is a hell of a lot. So in Australian cash, Basil's 75 poons would be $1,100 today.
Yep.
That's a lot of money.
Yes.
And no wonder he's losing it, because that could be their whole profit for the week.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that we've established that it's a substantial sum.
Not that he intended to put it into the account of the hotel or anything.
No way.
What would he do with it?
If he was Al Bundy, he'd put it towards his retirement property he hasn't told Peg about, that it turns out is built on a toxic waste dump that Jefferson frauded people with.
No, he'd put it into his car fund tin.
Yeah.
That he's buried in the backyard.
Oh, that's right. Yes, good call. Al would know what to do with the money. All right, let's get back to Fawlty Towers. Right, so Basil's great. He's like, okay, he's lost the plot at this point. He goes, £10 short. No, we can't have that. And he grabs this charity collection thing off the counter, full of change, and he's bashing the hell out of it to try to get 10 quid out of it. Yep. And to chill him out and snap him back to reality, Sybil throws this cup of cold tea over him to bring him back to his senses. But sadly, in the act of doing this, Prunella scales Mrs. John Cleese mostly, and
hitting
gets
the major.
So the major's just covered in all this stuff, which clearly wasn't meant to happen.
But they just kept on,
He just kept
going.
rolling. It was beautiful. Oh man, it was so good. Yeah, they kept it together brilliantly. Right, so Sybil promises to check the major's room because obviously somehow he has the money
For the balance of the...
for the balance.
the
Of
85 quid.
Yeah, perfect. So she goes off. Now, meanwhile, Mrs. Richards marches over to the major and Basil and starts grilling them on how on earth the major got her money. Now, we know Mrs. Richards is impossible to communicate with. And we also know that the major is likewise because of his memory. And so they're going to get nowhere. So Basil stupidly tries to take control. And you commented on this at the time. And
It's
you were
like
just
herding
shaking
cats,
it.
this conversation.
Ah. So somehow Basil's got to communicate to these two and convince Mrs. Richards that it is in fact Basil's money and not hers.
And then when this doesn't work, what's his solution to the problem?
Oh dear.
Manuel! Manuel!
Yeah, no, see, this is the thing. This is the brilliance of this show, is at that very moment Manuel happens to be walking by. Do you want to take it from here for a moment, or not really?
Oh, well, if you can just imagine a woman, argumentative woman, who's very rude and has no hearing, having this conversation with a guy with no memory,
Yeah.
and a
a
guy
third
that
guy.
can barely speak English. And Basil's trying to get them all
Yeah.
singing from the same songbook. It's just not going to happen.
And he's desperately, because this money slipped through his fingers,
Yeah.
and he so wants it back, and he's like, there's no point in trying to carry through with any of this, but he desperately does. Mrs. Richard basically declares Basil's ramblings to be utter rubbish and that it's her money. And then this all culminates in, please, Manuel, please explain to Mrs. Richards that I won this money on the house. He goes, I know
Yeah.
thing. And it's the brilliant classic all-time great I know nothing scene.
Yep.
And
Has
for
been
the
quoted
first time,
forever.
like, Manuel has taken such care to pay attention to what Mr. Fawlty said and follow instructions to the letter that he clears his throat and gets into the right stance and goes, I know nothing.
Meanwhile, Basil's just... His fists are clenched and he's leaning over and just wants to deck Manuel.
He totally does. And Manuel's so happy when he strides off, going about his business. Yeah, as you say, Basil's got his fists raised by this point. He's ready to kill Manuel, the Major, Mrs. Richards, and everyone else. Sybil's come back from searching the Major's room and tells Basil to fetch £10 from the till to give to Mrs. Richards. And she goes off to find Mrs. Richards. Basil's given up at this stage. He goes, right! And then he opens the till by smashing his head into it quite violently.
Nice work.
And he begins taking off his jacket and his shirt, and he strips down to his string vest. And so he's going to give her the shirt off his back as well.
Might as well.
Anyway, at this point, Basil puts his head on the counter and starts to cry quite loudly. When just the right time, a delivery dude walks
Sobbing.
in. Yeah. Oh, man.
Racking sobs.
And the delivery guy just finds Basil in his string vest crying. And he goes, Mr. Fawlty, who he obviously knows him reasonably well. Do you have a Mrs. Richards staying here? And Basil just, it's almost like he faints, but he just falls over on his flat on his back.
Back into the office.
But he does spring back up. And he says, yeah, what's it all about? And the guy explains Mrs. Richards bought a vase off them yesterday and got it delivered. But she also left behind one glove, which had £95, Steve, stashed in it. And Basil's gobsmacked and tells the man that he'll pass this money on to Mrs. Richards. And our man sort of hands over the cash and leaves. Now Basil's there at the counter alone, on his own, and he's holding the cash. Now, one of the beautiful moments here is the director has had the cameraman zoom right in on Basil with this money.
Yep.
And Basil sort of kisses the sky. And what that's just a beautiful, I'm no film expert, but that seems like a beautiful visual representation of what's in Basil's mind and heart at that point in time. Like his whole world is just revolving around this money. Anyway.
There's the roller coaster you were talking about.
Yeah. I'm probably getting...
I'm thinking to
trying
myself,
get too
Basil,
highbrow.
put that money away.
It's like that one in Bread. Do you remember, it's one of the main things I remember about the sitcom Bread is when Billy goes to use an ATM for the first time in the 80s when the ATMs were new.
Really hot stuff.
And he gets his money out and he just can't believe that money just came out of the wall. And he's holding it much as Basil is in wonderment of A, having money for the first time in his life, and B, he's just used this electronic gadget. And of course someone goes straight by and whips it out of his hand and runs off. And
No
they
doubt.
told him, they said, Billy,
No doubt Joey goes and gets it back
Ah,
later in
absolutely.
the episode or something.
Good call.
Where are we up to?
Basil's simply holding this cash in his hands, and Polly walks in, and Basil joyfully exclaims that he's up on the deal, and she's a bit bewildered. We've got a clip.
We found her money.
Where?
Well, it doesn't matter. I'm £10 up on the deal.
£10
Yes, it's 95. Even if I give her 10, I'm still 10 up. Polly, for the first time in my life, I'm winning.
Hello, Mrs. Richards. How lovely to see. Your beautiful vase that you bought yesterday has just arrived. Now, remind me, the money that you have there, is it yours or mine?
I told you, it's mine.
You're absolutely sure?
Yes, I am.
But you're still £10 short?
Yes.
Polly, give Mrs. Richards this, would you?
What's that?
This is mine.
Sorry, Steve, you were going to say
Oh,
something.
just that this is another example of her being a bit behind the 8 ball. Which is cunningly done.
Yes, and she's going to be put on the spot.
Again.
Yeah. So, as the listener just heard, Mrs. Richards is all square. Basil's holding 95 quid in his hands. He's almost dying with happiness, by the way. But he still has no shirt on. He's covered in cold tea, and he's looking completely manic. And at that point, Sybil walks up behind him from the office, sees the money and says, "What's that, Basil?" And he goes, "Ah!" But Polly helpfully and quickly says it's hers, right, which she won from that horse. Now, this all checks out, right, with what she was told earlier. And she asks Mr. Fawlty to put it in the safe for her. And this all seems to be acceptable. But no one contradicts her anyway. But there's silence, and Basil's thinking, if I let this silence carry on, someone's going to contradict this.
Yeah.
So he goes, "Right, that's all sorted. I shall put your money in the safe, Polly. Mrs. Richards, here is your beautiful vase." And he picks it up and he holds it to hand it over to her. And then the Major comes belting in. He goes, "Fawlty, I do remember that money. You won it on that horse." To all and sundry, at which point Sybil whips the money out of Basil's hand, which causes him to lose the vase in his other hand,
Yep.
which goes smash on the floor.
And how much did the vase cost?
Well, as Mrs. Richards loudly exclaims, "That cost £75.
Yep.
And so Sybil's counting out the money for Mrs. Richards and a fade to black.
So who got the £20 that was left over? Sybil bought a wig with it.
I don't know. Yeah, she would have done.
Phew.
Yeah, I haven't done the accountancy on this episode.
That was an effort.
Oh, it was. I don't even know what to say after all of that lot. Where do you want to go first?
I want to talk about Mrs. Richards being a skinflint.
Okay.
And I think this is partly lost on us these days because of the inflation issue
Oh.
and conversion issue that you were talking about. Because, well, three things happen. She comes in and she wants £5 broken for her cab fare.
Right.
Then we hear through the conversation with her sister, through Basil, that she's been offered 85,000 for her house in Brighton.
And she won't take a penny less
And she
than
won't.
92.5 or whatever.
And then the final one is that she spent £85 on this vase.
Which we know is
An absolute flippin' fortune.
about £700 or £800 these days.
So she's obviously completely loaded, right?
Yep.
But then she's trying to whittle Basil down on the price of the room because of the supposedly non-existent view and the size of the bath and all this sort of ridiculous
Yeah.
stuff. It's just... She's horrible.
Yeah, she is.
Completely
She is
horrible.
Yeah. She doesn't listen to anybody, or she can't listen to anybody, but when she can, she doesn't.
And she uses that as a tactic in these negotiations to try and drive the price down and everything like that.
To pretend not to hear people.
Yeah. Anyway, so I just wanted to point out that.
So on that topic, though, is that because when people come into Fawlty Towers, right, and quite often in these episodes, they're extremely reasonable or even just ordinarily pleasant people, but Basil's just a bastard to them because he doesn't like the plebs and he wants to have posh people in his hotel. And so these are good, nice people that he's mean to. But in this case, this is one of the few instances.
Yeah, and it has to be that way.
Yeah.
Because you
Well,
know
you feel
that she
sorry
is
for him.
someone who is just not going to stop until she has got her money.
Yeah.
And there's nothing Basil can do to get around,
No.
to sidestep her or anything like that.
No. It's one of the instances where he's justified in insulting her. And I think by having a deaf antagonist, he can openly insult her. I mean, he does openly insult other people, but he could really openly insult her
Yep.
on this one. And they had to make her a nasty person because you don't want to openly insult a nice person. Anyway, sorry, yes.
No, that was all I had to say on that subject.
Oh, okay.
What else?
Oh,
Well, I just said about the plot that we're always ramping things up. Like we've talked about this before in Fawlty Towers. It builds and builds and builds. So we've got the lies on top of the lies on top of the lies, and Polly comes up with a brilliant lie, but then that needs to be covered up by doing something else, and it just piles on top of each other.
And everyone has to know their part.
The money's slowly going up as well, because
Ah, good point. Yeah, right.
you think he's got £75, but then maybe he's got more than that. And then, yeah, it goes up and down and all over the place.
Yeah.
And then, of course, to resolve all this, he's got to try and attempt the impossible, which is to bring the three
Oh, my goodness.
people into alignment, and that's just never going to happen. So
No.
it's sheer genius. Maddening,
Oh,
sheer genius.
well, yeah. No, absolutely. I agree. All right, well then, so because the list of gags will be quite long, shall we get into those?
Basil says of gambling that particular avenue of pleasure has been closed off to him.
And she goes, and we don't want it open again, do we, Basil? And he goes, no, you certainly don't, dear.
Yes, that's a nice one. Later, when Sybil's walked in on him being happy in the kitchen, she says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, it's just my way of getting through the day. The Samaritans were engaged." So he was suicidal, but instead he's affected this happy tone to
just to
getting
try
through.
and get through the day. And what I love about that is he goes, oh, yes, happy, I remember that.
At the end of the conversation with Manuel, where he's anticipating the questioning by Sybil, he says somewhere along the line, and I mentioned it already, about Manuel being a nitwit, and then this gets confused with there being a second horse, possibly called Nitwit. And then Manuel turns around at the end of the conversation and goes, "What is witnit?" Oh, that's the funniest thing ever.
Yeah. Brilliantly delivered, and Basil hasn't got time to explain what is witnit.
No.
Oh,
Here comes Sybil. When Mrs. Richards bangs her head on the shelf in the office, Basil leans over on the floor and goes, "Is this a piece of your brain?"
Oh. Well, there's... she goes, my head, and he goes, has it come away? You better lie down before something else bad happens.
He tries ushering her upstairs.
No, all of that's fantastic. Yep, absolutely. Look, just to go back to the conversation with Manuel that you were just speaking about, something that I very much like is at the very end, because Basil's gone to great pains to tell Manuel that he mustn't say anything at all. At the end of all this, when the penny finally drops, Manuel just goes, "I know, you told me this morning." And exactly.
Where did he get that from?
He's totally picked that up from Basil.
Yeah.
And he does it in another episode as well. He goes, "Wicked." And he just goes, "I know, you tell me this morning." It was just, Basil had gone through all that for nothing.
Yep.
Manuel was already not going to say anything. Anyway, yeah. Mrs. Richards goes, "Manager." And on the other side of the room, Basil appears and he's cupped his hands around his mouth. He goes, testing. And just, there's tons of that in there.
Yep.
Oh, right. What else you got?
Well, in the conversation with the Major about where he's going next after he's had a drinky, he says that he's going to a remembrance service. And then, of course, the joke is that the next day he can't remember the remembrance service.
Ah, well done. I hadn't picked up on that at all.
He denies that it was a remembrance service at all.
He thought he was off to the theatre.
Yeah. Oh. Was he with the lady, or was he talking about the actress?
I think he was talking about the actress.
Anyway, he was completely confused about what was going on.
Totally. Oh, yes, I've got one other one from that conversation with Manuel. It's just such a rich seam to mine. Just the sheer desperation on poor old Basil when he goes, "Manuel, please try to understand before one of us dies." It's just that line. Oh, my goodness.
The only other thing I had left was because we covered everything else. In the scene where Polly has just told Sybil and everyone else that the money that Basil's now got in his hand is hers.
To be put in the safe.
Yes, to be
at
put
the
in
very
the safe.
end.
It's her winnings.
Mm-hmm.
There's this quiet moment, which you mentioned, and Basil just has this look on his face as he's waiting to see, or kind of out of the corner of his eye, what Sybil's reaction is going to be. And then, as you said,
no one contradicts it.
Yeah, not wanting to let it linger too long, he launches into the next part of the conversation. But just the look on his face, the sheer terror waiting to see what's going to happen next. But he does that several times throughout this episode. Like when she comes into the kitchen behind him,
Oh, yeah.
he knows something's up.
And yeah, and the expression on his face. And she sees that expression on his face, so she knows.
Yep. What else have you got?
This next thing isn't a gag, right? But it's leading up to, what I'm going to say about appreciating the brilliance of Fawlty Towers. A lot of the stuff at the end hinges on Basil dropping the vase. Now, on the face of it, it's actually already very convincing because he's got cash in one hand, vase in another hand, and Sybil's snuck up behind him and whipped cash out of his hand, which he wasn't expecting, and gives him a fright. He might drop the vase. But you could argue that he wouldn't drop the vase. Now, they've set it up a few episodes before that. Apparently, he's got a habit of dropping things when he's had a shock.
Yep.
Because in a previous episode, Polly's had some bad news for Basil, and she says, put the bottle down, and he ignores her, and she gives him the bad news, and he drops the bottle. And I think this is a few episodes before this one. Or as this one opens the second series, it must have happened back 4 years earlier in the first series. But they've carried that through. They've laid the groundwork.
Yeah.
And that's the insane attention to detail
Nicely done.
that they do. It's incredible. It was the episode where they were hosting the gourmet night, and Basil's got these expensive wines.
Yes.
And Polly has to come in and tell him that Kurt has got blackout drunk and tried to crack on to Manuel, and none of the food's been prepared, and the whole night's gone down the toilet.
Yep. He's pickled the herring.
Yeah.
And all that sort of thing.
Yes. Right, so if you've got nothing else to say,
Nope.
then I'll go through my justifications.
Yes.
So when I was writing the synopsis on this, it gave you because I try to be very careful in conversation. We'll go, oh, he does this and he does that and he does that. But there's 3 he's in a certain scene, right? So it could be the Major, it could be Basil, could be Manuel, whoever. And if I say she, it could be Mrs. Richards, Polly or Sybil. So when you're writing the synopsis, you have to be very careful to call everyone by their name. And then you come to a realization about entrances and exits. And people have to either be there to hear a certain thing or not be there. And not only do you have to shuffle all these people around, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't seem contrived. And as I was writing the synopsis, it just suddenly dawned on me all these things people say about Fawlty Towers being brilliant. And the mechanics of it are just insane.
Yep.
The sheer precision they have to have for everything and everybody to be where it needs to be. And so subtly, it's just, it blew my mind, dude. It's an incredible sitcom. So I think, as far as the art form goes, this is one of the finest examples. But that doesn't mean I actually enjoy it. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
It's like you could go, I'm going to the world's greatest dentist. And when I walk out of there, I'm incredibly pleased with the work this dentist has done. But I didn't enjoy the procedure.
You've still had the tooth pulled.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit like that. But having watched them all, I don't think there's a single episode that couldn't go into the Hall of Fame.
Wow.
And the reason this one was chosen is that after, through all of these, it's the one that made me laugh the most. So it wasn't about how complex the plot was or any other things. It was just this one got the most laughs. And that's why it got chosen. So there you go. That's my justification for choosing this episode. So shall we pop this one in the Hall of Fame, dude?
Oh, absolutely.
Brilliant.
Yeah, no question. It's right up there.
Yeah. Well, look, that brings us to the end of another episode of Sitcom Showdown. Quite a long one, I should say. Now, you are going to supply an episode for January.
Yes.
To follow this one.
I
But
am.
then are we doing something special in February?
Yes, we are.
Okay,
As
can
we
you explain
previous-
that to me and the listeners?
As we previously said, we were going to do a Good Place retrospective, and the plan was to do it in January, but now I've seen their schedule of episodes and when they're released. The final episode of The Good Place doesn't get released until the very end of January, so in order to give us time to prepare for that fully, we'll be doing it in Feb. So there will be only one episode in February, which will be that special one about The Good Place. Looking back on the 4 seasons and having a good old chinwag about what happened and how well they landed it and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, okie dokie. So that's just a bit of a heads up for people.
Yep.
For February.
Yeah, a bit of homework for your listeners.
Brilliant.
4 seasons of The Good Place. Chop chop.
I guess I better do that as well. Okay, well, that's it. Let's get out of here. And, dear listener, thank you for tuning in once
Yes.
again to Sitcom Showdown.
Good on ya. We'll see you in about a fortnight.
All right, cheers. Join us next time on Sitcom Showdown when we'll be putting another 5-star episode under the microscope. And in the meantime, you can contact us with feedback on Facebook, Twitter @Sitcom Showdown, or by email sitcomshowdown@gmail.com.